The ancients believed that one question could set a person free or drive them into despair. It was not asked in the open squares of Rome, nor carved into the laws of Athens. It lived quietly in the minds of philosophers, whispered in private, written in fragile lines that survived only because someone dared to copy them again and again. The question is simple, and yet it is dangerous. What if the worst thing that could happen to you has already happened in your mind? To the Stoics, this was no game. They believed that fear feeds on surprise, that pain grows sharper when it catches us unprepared. So they trained themselves to walk willingly into imagined ruin, to see their fortunes lost, their loved ones gone, their own lives ended. Not because they were morbid, but because they believed freedom begins where fear ends. Consider the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He ruled the greatest empire of his age, commanded vast armies, and held the power of life and death. Yet at night, by candlelight, he wrote words not of conquest, but of surrender. You may leave this life at any moment. Let that determine what you do, say, and think. Why would the most powerful man alive remind himself of his own fragility? Because he knew that power means nothing if the soul is ruled by terror. Think also of Epictetus, born into slavery, his body broken, his freedom denied. He had nothing, and yet he claimed to be freer than his masters. His secret was not wealth or status, but the practice of imagining loss until it no longer frightened him. He learned that when you accept the worst in thought, you cannot be enslaved by it in reality. This thought experiment, called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, was their weapon. It stripped misfortune of its surprise. It turned tragedy into training, but it was also dangerous. Used wrongly, it could lead to cold detachment or reckless despair. Used rightly, it gave men the courage to face storms that would break others. Tonight, we enter that world. We walk alongside emperors and exiles, soldiers and slaves. We step into the experiment that promised unshakable calm, if one dared to face it. Stay with this journey, for once you see as they saw, you may never look at your own life the same way again. As the candle burns low and the night begins to fade, we return to the question that haunted the Stoics. What if every disaster that could befall you has already happened in your mind? What if you rehearsed the losses, walked through the ruins, tasted the bitterness, and in doing so discovered that you could still stand? The experiment is not meant to darken your life. It is meant to free it, to look at death so that you may live, to imagine loss so that you may love, to accept fate so that you may act with courage while you still have time. Think of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who ruled with armies at his command, and yet reminded himself each morning of mortality and betrayal. His greatness was not in conquest, but in calm, in refusing to be ruled by fear. Think of Epictetus, the slave who owned nothing, yet declared that nothing could enslave his mind. His power was not in possessions, but in freedom of spirit. Think of Seneca, rich and influential, yet sleeping on the floor to prove to himself that fortune could never own him. His wisdom was not in comfort, but in clarity. These men lived in an age of plagues, wars, and political chaos. We live in an age of noise, speed, and uncertainty. Their struggles were different in detail, but not in kind. Like them, we will lose. Like them, we will die. The only question is whether we will face these truths with trembling or with steadiness. The Stoic experiment offers a choice. You can avert your eyes from fear, pretending it is not there, and live in quiet dread. Or you can walk into it willingly, meet it in imagination, and rob it of its power. When you do, you discover the strange paradox the Stoics cherished. By imagining death, you begin to live. By picturing loss, you awaken gratitude. By embracing fate, you find freedom. Pause for a moment. Picture the one thing you fear losing most. The job, the fortune, the health, the person. Picture it gone. Feel the hollow space it would leave. Now open your eyes to the truth. It is still here. For now, that is the miracle. That is the gift. And because it is fragile, it deserves your full attention. This is why the thought experiment matters. Not to numb you, but to awaken you. Not to make you indifferent, but to make you urgent. When you remember that life can be stripped away in a breath, every breath becomes precious. When you recall that time is slipping past, every moment becomes an opportunity. And when you realize that nothing external is truly yours, you begin to live with the strength that comes from owning yourself. The Stoics cannot walk this path for you. They can only point the way. Marcus, Epictetus, Seneca, they left fragments, reminders, hints. But the experiment must be lived, not merely studied. It must be practiced quietly in the solitude of your own mind until the fear loosens and the gratitude deepens. So let this be your invitation. Tonight, before sleep, close your eyes and step into the exercise. Imagine the loss. Imagine the end. Let yourself feel it. And then awaken tomorrow with new eyes, seeing what remains not as ordinary, but as extraordinary. This is the gift the Stoics preserved, the ability to live unafraid, to love more deeply, to meet fate with an open heart. And so I leave you with one question, the same question that echoes across centuries, whispered in marble halls and desert cells, whispered now into your ear. If tomorrow stripped away everything you take for granted, what part of you would remain unbroken? Carry that question, let it shape you, and if these ancient voices have spoken to you tonight, do not let them fade into silence. Join this journey further. There are more lessons, more experiments, more truths buried in time that can sharpen the way you live now. Subscribe, stay with this channel, and together we will walk deeper into the wisdom of those who faced storms and discovered peace. For their stories are not finished until we live them, and your life is not finished until you dare to begin living it fully. In the language of the ancients, it was called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. The phrase sounds grim, even unsettling, yet to the Stoics, it was a practice of liberation, not despair. At its heart, the exercise was deceptively simple. Imagine the misfortunes that might strike you tomorrow and face them before they arrive. Not only the small inconveniences, a delay, an insult, a coin lost, but the great disasters as well. The death of a friend, the loss of your wealth, the collapse of your health, the end of your own life. Why would anyone do this? Why deliberately walk through horrors in the safety of your own mind? To the modern ear, it seems backwards. We are told to visualize success, to think positively, to build castles in our imagination. But the Stoics believed the opposite strategy brought greater strength. They argued that if you can stand calmly in the ruins of your own imagined life, then reality can never truly defeat you. Seneca, the Roman statesman and philosopher, put it plainly: he robs present ills of their power who has perceived their coming beforehand. When we rehearse misfortune, its arrival no longer shocks us. Pain may still visit, but its sharpest weapon, surprise, has been blunted. To understand this better, picture an archer at practice. He does not wait for the chaos of battle to test his skill. He fires arrow after arrow in quiet fields, so that when the storm of war comes, his movements are steady, automatic, unshaken. The Stoics believed the mind required the same discipline. Each night, they would draw back the bow of imagination and fire at the darkest targets they could conceive, so that when those shadows appeared in real life, they could still aim true. Marcus. Aurelius, alone in his tent, did not write merely to comfort himself. His private notes, the Meditations, are filled with reminders that the world can break us at any time. Yet his tone is not fearful. Instead, it is steady, almost tender. "When you kiss your child good night," he warns himself, "whisper that he may not be here tomorrow." Harsh words to our ears, but to Marcus, this was not cruelty. It was clarity. Only by facing the fragile nature of life could he love more deeply in the present moment. Epictetus, born into slavery, offered the same lesson in different clothing. "When you embrace your wife or child," he said, "say to yourself, one day they will die." Not to make the heart cold, but to warm it. For when you remember that nothing is guaranteed, every ordinary moment becomes extraordinary. A simple meal, a shared laugh, even the act of waking to another sunrise becomes precious beyond measure. The thought experiment, then, had two purposes. First, it armed the soul against fear. By imagining loss, you stripped it of its terror. Second, it sharpened gratitude. By rehearsing absence, you learned to love presence more fiercely. This was not daydreaming, it was training. The Stoics approached it as soldiers approach drills, as athletes approach discipline. Night after night, they entered the arena of the Eua, mined and faced the worst fates they could imagine. Some whispered these visions aloud, others scratched them into wax tablets or murmured them in prayer. It was not about predicting the future, but about preparing for it. Yet even here the Stoics were cautious. They warned against letting this practice harden into despair. If you fixate only on loss, you can become bitter, withdrawn, fatalistic. The true Stoic path walked a thin line, to imagine ruin without becoming ruined by the imagination itself. The exercise was meant to polish the soul, not poison it. Think of it like walking into a cold river. At first, the shock makes you gasp. But after a moment, you adjust, you breathe, you find your strength within the chill. The water has not grown warmer, you have grown steadier. So too with premeditatio malorum. Life would not grow kinder, but you would grow stronger. This is the experiment, to step willingly into suffering before it comes, to live through loss in the theater of the mind, so that when the curtain rises on reality, you are ready. To many, it sounded bleak. To the Stoics, it was the most hopeful act of all. For when you have rehearsed the worst, you discover a strange secret. Nothing can truly take your freedom, for you have already faced the cost. At first glance, the Stoic experiment seems like madness. Why summon images of death, poverty, betrayal, exile? Why taste bitterness before it is poured? To most people, this sounds like opening the door to misery. Yet to the Stoics, it was the doorway to strength. The logic begins with a simple truth. Fear feeds on surprise. When something strikes us out of nowhere, it multiplies our suffering. The event itself wounds us once, but the shock, the disbelief, the frantic resistance, these wound us many times over. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality, Seneca wrote. It was his warning, but also his solution. If imagination can magnify our pain, then imagination can also train us to endure it. Consider the man who never thinks of loss. He convinces himself the roof will never leak, the market will never fall, the friends he loves will always remain. When life proves otherwise, he collapses under the weight of broken illusions. Compare him with the man who each night rehearses these possibilities. He wakes each day already at peace with their chance of arrival. To him, a cracked roof or lost coin is no ambush. It is familiar terrain. The Stoics believed this was the essence of philosophy, not endless speculation, but preparation for the blows of fate. Epictetus, whose leg was shattered by his master, said plainly, When you are going to undertake anything, remind yourself what kind of thing it is. He meant, if you go to bathe, expect to be splashed, jostled, insulted. If you go to war, expect blood and loss. If you live, expect death. Nothing that arrives will then feel foreign to you. This practice also served a deeper function. By imagining misfortune, the Stoic learned to separate what was truly his from what was only lent. Wealth, health, reputation, even the love of others, all of these could vanish. What remained? Only the ruling center of the soul, judgment, intention, choice. In rehearsing the loss of externals, the Stoic discovered the core that no power could strip away. Modern people might call this pessimism, but to the Stoics, it was the opposite. It was optimism at the deepest level, the faith that even when stripped of everything, a person could still stand upright. To them, practicing disaster was like inoculating the mind, a small taste of poison to prevent the full sickness of despair. Imagine two sailors caught in a sudden storm. One has only sailed on calm waters, imagining endless sunshine. The other has trained in foul weather, has studied the stars in darkness, has prepared for broken masts and torn sails. Which sailor panics? Which one acts? The storm is the same, but the soul inside the storm is different, and there was more. Premeditatio malorum was not only a shield against fear, but also a lens-sharpening gratitude. For when you spend a moment imagining your child gone, your fortune stolen, your health declined, and then open your eyes to see them still present, you taste joy more vividly than before. Seneca urged his readers, "He who has anticipated the coming of troubles takes away their power when they arrive, and he who has learned to look upon what he has as if it might be lost, has learned to enjoy it truly." This dual power, resilience and gratitude, made the practice irresistible to the Stoics. By rehearsing loss, they not only grew unafraid of tomorrow, but more alive to today. Marcus Aurelius captured it when he reminded himself, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." The awareness of mortality did not paralyze him. It pushed him toward kindness, urgency, presence. So why imagine the worst? Because the worst will come sooner or later in some form. To pretend otherwise is to live in fragile denial. To face it in thought is to live with a steady heart. The Stoics believed that only those who walk through the valley of loss in their minds can walk through life itself without chains. If the Stoics asked their students to imagine misfortune, it was not to dwell in gloom. The exercise was meant to unlock a set of hidden treasures, the kind of treasures that cannot be stolen by thieves or burned by fire. What then were the fruits of this strange discipline? 3 stand above the rest: freedom from fear, gratitude for the present, and resilience in the storms of life. The first and most immediate benefit was liberation. Fear has always been one of humanity's fiercest chains. It bends kings, humbles warriors, and leaves ordinary people trembling at shadows. Yet the Stoics discovered that fear depends on uncertainty. When we do not know what will come, our imagination torments us with endless possibilities. By rehearsing disaster, the Stoics removed the sting of surprise. They learned to say, "Yes, this too may happen, and if it does, I am prepared." Seneca observed that misfortune becomes lighter when anticipated. What is quite unlooked for is more crushing in its effect, and unexpectedness adds to the weight of a disaster. For him, the act of imagining stripped calamity of its mystery. And once the unknown was known, fear lost its teeth. Imagine waking each morning with the knowledge that no loss, no insult, no illness could shake the foundation of your soul. This is not cold indifference. It is strength. It is the quiet courage of someone who has already rehearsed the worst in the theatre of the mind and thus walks calmly through the world. The second treasure hidden in this exercise is gratitude. At first, this seems paradoxical. How could picturing death or poverty make life more joyful? Yet the Stoics believed the shadow of loss makes the light of presence burn brighter. Marcus Aurelius urged himself, "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly." By imagining that the day was already his last, he found renewed urgency to savor its moments. Epictetus taught his students to practice detachment, not to strip love away, but to make it purer. When you remind yourself that the friend you embrace or the child you tuck into bed may not be there tomorrow, you do not love them less. You love them more fiercely, knowing the hour is fragile. Seneca carried this practice into action. Once a month, he would strip away comfort deliberately, sleeping on the hard ground, eating coarse bread, wearing the simplest clothing. When asked why, he replied, "Is this the condition that I feared?" By practicing loss, he turned ordinary comfort into extraordinary pleasure. A warm meal, a soft bed, a friend's laughter, all glowed brighter when contrasted against their imagined absence. Gratitude, then, was not a luxury to the Stoics. It was a form of armor. A grateful man, they argued, is untouchable, for he sees every small gift as fortune and every misfortune as training. The final benefit of premeditatio malorum was resilience. Life will strike. That much the Stoics never denied. No amount of philosophy can erase pain, illness, or death. What philosophy can do is decide how we meet them. Epictetus said, "Circumstances don't make the man, they only reveal him to himself." A storm reveals whether a house is built on sand or stone. In the same way, a crisis reveals whether a soul has been prepared. By imagining hardships beforehand, Stoics built their inner foundation. When the blow finally landed, they did not crumble. Think of Marcus Aurelius, who ruled in a time of plague, war, and betrayal. He faced repeated disaster, yet his writings do not drip with despair. They show a man who had already met these enemies in thought, and thus could endure them in reality. His empire might crack, his health might fade, his friends might betray him, but his mind, trained by philosophy, remained firm. This resilience was not arrogance. The Stoics did not claim invincibility. They claimed preparedness. They taught that a blow is lighter when the soul has braced itself. And just as a soldier trains with heavy armor so that he is swift on the battlefield, so too does the philosopher train with imagined burdens so that he is light when real ones arrive. Yet the true brilliance of the practice lay in balance. Was not about endless brooding on death and ruin. That would be morbid and destructive. The goal was moderation. Enough rehearsal to soften the sting, enough reflection to deepen gratitude, but never so much that one drowned in despair. The Stoics believed philosophy was a medicine. Too little, and the illness of fear returns. Too much, and the medicine itself becomes poison. But the right measure, taken daily, transforms life. Thus, the Stoics found in this strange exercise a triad of power: freedom from fear, gratitude for the present, and resilience in crisis. They believed that any man or woman who practiced it would stand differently in the world, not as someone immune to loss, but as someone no longer enslaved by it. This was the reward of imagining the worst: not darkness, but light; not despair, but a soul sharpened into strength. Every powerful practice carries its shadow. The Stoics knew this well. A thought experiment capable of freeing the soul could also twist into something harmful if misunderstood. The same exercise that sharpened resilience could harden into coldness or slide into despair. This is why the Stoics insisted that premeditatio malorum, the rehearsal of misfortune, must be approached with wisdom and balance. The first danger is mistaking preparation for pessimism. Some people, hearing the Stoics speak of imagining death, ruin, or betrayal, believed the philosophers were advocating endless worry. To live in constant dread of loss is not Stoic strength, but weakness in disguise. Seneca warned against this confusion. He urged his students not to shackle themselves with anxiety masquerading as foresight. He who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. If you imagine disasters without purpose, you bleed twice, once in fear and once in reality. Stoic practice is not about drowning in scenarios, but about tasting them briefly to build immunity. The second danger lies at the other extreme: nihilism. A careless student might hear the Stoics say, "All things are fleeting, wealth and health and life itself," and conclude, "Then nothing matters." This is the dark abyss the Stoics fought to avoid. Marcus Aurelius himself confronted this temptation. Surrounded by plague, betrayal, and endless war, he reminded himself daily that all things pass. Yet he added a crucial command: "While you live, while it is in your power, be good." The awareness of mortality was not meant to drain meaning, but to intensify it. The thought of death should not make us reckless or indifferent, but rather kinder, wiser, and more deliberate. Another danger is the loss of warmth. Practicing detachment, some grew rigid, mistaking numbness for strength. Epictetus warned his followers not to become statues. "Remember that you are a man," he said, "and that what befalls a man is natural." To feel sorrow at loss or grief at death is not a failure of philosophy. It is the mark of being human. The Stoic exercise was never intended to erase emotion, but to keep emotion from becoming tyranny. Imagine a father who, rehearsing his child's death, convinces himself never to feel attachment. He tells himself, "This is Stoic wisdom." But when the child laughs or reaches for his hand, the father feels nothing. This is not strength, it is a distortion. True Stoicism teaches us to love more fiercely because we know the bond is fragile, not to withhold love in the hope of avoiding pain. Finally, there is the danger of false courage. A soldier might say, "Since death is nothing, I will rush headlong into danger," careless of consequence. But this too betrays the philosophy. Stoic training was meant to produce calm judgment, not reckless abandon. To imagine death is to prepare for it, not to seek it without reason. Courage, in the Stoic sense, is rational endurance of hardship, not blind pursuit of destruction. So, how did the Stoics guard against misuse? They set boundaries, practice premeditatio malorum, but do so with intent. Imagine loss not to wallow in it, but to measure your strength against it. Picture death not to despise life, but to embrace it. Think of misfortune not to withdraw from the world, but to act wisely within it. Seneca gave his students a rhythm, a few days each month spent in poverty, eating coarse food, wearing rough clothes. Not every day, lest life become joyless, but enough to remind the soul of its power. Marcus wrote nightly of death and impermanence, but by day he ruled with justice, fought wars with patience, and tried to act for the common good. Epictetus trained his mind against loss, but also urged compassion, laughter, and friendship. In other words, Stoic foresight was never meant to extinguish humanity. It was meant to free it. Misfortune rehearsed in thought should make us more grateful, not less. It should make us calmer, not colder. The Stoics knew the temptation to misuse their philosophy would always remain. It is easier to become numb than to remain balanced, easier to collapse into dread than to face hardship calmly. But the true Stoic way demands vigilance. The practice is a knife. In skilled hands, it carves strength. In careless hands, it wounds the one who wields it, and so they left us this warning. Do not let the experiment become your prison. Let it be your training ground. Walk through imagined ruin, not to despair of life, but to return to it with greater clarity, gratitude, and resolve. The Stoic exercise of rehearsing misfortune did not appear in isolation. It was part of a much older current of thought, flowing through many cultures, carried in different words but shaped by the same recognition. Life is fragile, uncertain, and brief. And only by facing this truth can we learn to live with strength. Long before the Stoics, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus declared, "All things flow." To him, the universe was not fixed but ever-changing, like a river in constant motion. He reminded his listeners, "You cannot step into the same river twice. The waters have moved on, and so have you." This vision of ceaseless change influenced the Stoics deeply. If all things are in flux, then clinging to stability is an illusion. Loss is not a possibility, it is a certainty. To imagine loss, then, is simply to imagine reality unfolding as it must. In this way, premeditatio malorum was not pessimism, but alignment with the nature of the cosmos. By practicing misfortune, one harmonizes with the river instead of fighting against its current. Across the world in India, Buddhist monks were practicing something strikingly similar. They meditated on impermanence and death, often contemplating their own bodies as subject to decay. Far from being morbid, this awareness produced compassion and detachment. One well-known Buddhist reflection instructs, "Of all the footprints, that of the elephant is supreme. Of all contemplations, that on death is supreme." By facing mortality daily, monks stripped away illusion and attachment, finding peace in the fleeting nature of life. The Stoic reminder to whisper to yourself, "You may die tomorrow," is a cousin to the Buddhist practice of maranasati, mindfulness of death. Both traditions sought not despair, but clarity. When death is no longer hidden, life becomes luminous. Even in early Christianity, echoes of this practice resound. The phrase memento mori, remember that you will die, became a spiritual discipline. Monks carried skulls into their cells, not to frighten themselves, but to recall the brevity of earthly existence. The goal was not coldness, but urgency, a reminder that every act mattered, every choice carried eternal weight. Like the Stoics, these Christians saw death not as an end to dread, but as a teacher to revere. Marcus Aurelius would have recognized their spirit, even if their theology diverged. For both, mortality was a compass, orienting the soul toward what truly matters. What made Stoicism unique was its ability to weave these threads, flux, impermanence, mortality, into a practical daily exercise. While Heraclitus spoke of cosmic change and Buddhists practiced renunciation, the Stoics asked, how can an ordinary citizen, a senator, a soldier, or a slave, use this wisdom to live today? Their answer was premeditatio malorum. Unlike abstract speculation, this was a tool for daily life. Marcus used it before ruling the empire. Epictetus taught it to students struggling with anger or grief. Seneca recommended it to friends navigating wealth, power, and exile. It was not confined to monasteries or ivory towers. It was a philosophy for kitchens, marketplaces, and battlefields. The fact that so many traditions converged on this practice reveals something timeless. Wherever humans have lived, they have wrestled with uncertainty, loss, and the inevitability of death. The Stoics, Buddhists, and monks each reached the same conclusion. Only by bringing misfortune into the light can we remove its tyranny. Different words, same insight. Heraclitus, all things change. Buddha, all conditioned things are impermanent. Marcus Aurelius, you could leave life right now. To each the thought of loss was not poison, but medicine. To deny it was to live in fear. To face it was to live in freedom. Tracing these roots shows that premeditatio malorum is not just a Stoic curiosity. It is part of the wider human project of learning how to live when nothing is guaranteed. It links us to the ancients across cultures, reminding us that our struggles are not new. The fears that haunt us today, losing our jobs, our health, our loved ones, are simply modern faces of the same ancient truth. And so, when we practice the Stoic experiment, we are not alone. We stand in a long line of seekers, Greeks, watching rivers, Buddhists meditating on death, monks whispering memento mori. Together they tell us, the way out of fear is not denial, but courage. And courage begins with the imagination of loss. It is easy to relegate Stoic practices to the dusty world of scrolls and emperors. Marcus Aurelius writing in a candlelit tent, Epictetus teaching in a small courtyard, Seneca writing letters to distant friends. But the power of premeditatio malorum is not confined to marble statues and Latin phrases. It is meant for us, for the modern world with all its noise, pressures, and fragile certainties. Consider the fear of losing a job. In a culture that ties identity to career, the thought of dismissal can feel like death itself. Most people avoid even imagining it. They live in quiet dread of the unexpected email, the sudden meeting, the words, "We have to let you go." The Stoic experiment asks you to imagine this happening tonight. Picture the email, the conversation, the walk out of the building with a box in hand. Let yourself feel the sting in advance. At first, it seems unbearable. But after the storm of panic, something surprising happens. You see that life goes on. Friends remain, skills remain, the capacity to rebuild remains. You discover that while the event may be painful, it cannot take everything from you. By imagining loss, you make the prospect survivable, or think of health. We live as though the body will serve us endlessly, forgetting how fragile it is. But the Stoics urged us to remember its frailty daily. Imagine the diagnosis. Imagine the sudden weakness, the test results, the bed you cannot rise from. Again, the first wave is grief. But then comes clarity. If this body can fail, then today's walk matters more. The meal with a friend matters more. Every moment unbroken by pain becomes a treasure. This was Seneca's point in practicing poverty. By imagining the worst, he discovered how much he could live without and how rich the ordinary actually was. For us, rehearsing frailty makes each day of strength a victory. The practice also reshapes how we love. Epictetus urged parents to remember that children, like all of us, are mortal. This was not meant to strip affection, but to deepen it. When we remind ourselves that those we love will not always be here, we hold them closer. A simple dinner together, a casual laugh, a brief embrace, all glow brighter when seen against the backdrop of impermanence. In modern terms, this means resisting the urge to take people for granted. Instead of rushing through conversations with friends or family, the Stoic experiment nudges us to pause, to see each encounter as fragile and precious. By imagining absence, presence becomes luminous. The Stoics often paired imagination with small acts of practice. Seneca slept on the floor to taste poverty. Marcus reminded himself that every insult, every inconvenience was part of human nature. We too can create small drills. Spend a weekend without technology to remind yourself how little is necessary. Walk instead of driving. Eat plain food instead of delicacies. Live for a moment as if stripped of luxury, or simply, at night, write down one thing you fear losing, then picture it gone. The next morning, when you find it still there, gratitude blossoms. Still, we must be careful not to misuse the exercise. The Stoics did not recommend endless brooding on catastrophe. The purpose is not to flood yourself with dread, but to inoculate yourself against it. Like a vaccine, a small dose strengthens, too much overwhelms. The rhythm of practice is key, a few moments of contemplation, then a return to action with renewed clarity. Our own age is not so different from the Roman world. They lived with plagues, so do we. They faced political instability, so do we. They feared betrayal, loss, decline, death. The costumes change, but the human condition remains. This is why premeditatio malorum still matters. It is not about dwelling in ruins, but about discovering that ruins cannot touch the core of who you are. It is about remembering, in a world of constant distraction, what is truly yours, the power to meet life with steadiness, even when everything else slips away. The greatest evidence of its power is how life looks after you practice it. The small annoyances, traffic, insults, delays, lose their bite. The larger fears, illness, financial strain, rejection, lose their grip. You still feel them, but they do not rule you. You carry within you a kind of invisible armor, forged not by denial, but by rehearsal. And in that space where fear once lived, something else enters: joy. Not shallow joy, dependent on luck or comfort, but deep joy born of clarity. The joy of realizing that today, in this fragile moment, you are alive, you are breathing, and nothing else is guaranteed. The Stoics did not stop at merely imagining misfortune. To them, endurance alone was not enough. A soldier can grit his teeth through pain. A prisoner can resign himself to chains. But philosophy sought something higher, not only to accept what fate delivered, but to love it. This deeper transformation was called amor fati, the love of fate. To love fate means more than bearing it without complaint. It means seeing even the hardest blows as threads in a larger tapestry. What others call tragedy, the Stoic calls instruction. What others call accident, the Stoic calls design. Life ceases to be a sequence of random disruptions and becomes a coherent whole, stitched together by necessity. Marcus Aurelius wrote often of this. In his private meditations he urged himself, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart." These words are not the tone of resignation. They are the words of a man who believed that the very shape of his hardships was part of a greater order, one he might not see, but one he could honor. Epictetus too pressed this lesson. He had no illusions about life's cruelty. He had known slavery, injury, ridicule. Yet his counsel was not to curse what happened, but to align himself with it. "Do not seek for things to happen the way you want them to," he said. "Rather, wish that what happens happen the way it happens, and you will be happy." The freedom he taught was not freedom from suffering, but freedom from resistance. This subtle shift marks the difference between Stoic endurance and Stoic joy. To endure is to carry a burden. To love is to transform the burden into meaning. When you love fate, even disaster becomes a teacher, even pain becomes a sculptor of the soul. The image is of a craftsman's hand. The hammer that strikes the iron may feel like violence, but in truth it is shaping the blade. So too with fate. Each blow that falls is part of the forging of character. To curse the hammer is to misunderstand the art. To accept it is wisdom. To love it is greatness. Yet the Stoics were careful not to fall into sentimentality. They did not preach blind optimism. To love fate is not to say that every event is pleasant. It is to say that every event belongs. A plague that kills thousands is not good in itself, but it belongs to the order of nature, and from its presence, new strength, new compassion, or new clarity may emerge. The death of a friend is not sweet, but it is woven into the same fabric that gave the joy of knowing them. To love fate is to love the whole cloth, not only its brightest threads. In this way, amor fati becomes the natural extension of premeditatio, malorum. At first, you imagine loss to prepare yourself against fear. In time, you see that loss itself is not alien, but part of the same universe that gave you life. You begin with resistance, move to acceptance, and end in embrace. This attitude changes how one lives daily life. An insult from another no longer provokes outrage. It is simply one of the sounds of the world. A delay on the road no longer feels like theft of time. It becomes time offered for reflection. Even personal failure loses its sting, because it too is part of the process of growth. What once seemed hostile now appears as part of the curriculum of existence. Nietzsche, centuries later, would seize upon this Stoic seed and turn it into a central principle of his own philosophy. He declared, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, but to love it." Though Nietzsche's voice was not Stoic in every sense, he grasped the same fire. That freedom is not only to endure fate, but to delight in its unfolding. For the Stoics, this delight was not a hollow smile forced in tragedy. It was a deep current of harmony flowing beneath every event. If all is nature, and if we ourselves are part of nature, then what happens to us is not an invasion, but an unfolding. To reject it is to reject reality. To embrace it is to be at one with it. Here lies the highest lesson of their thought experiment. To imagine the worst is only the beginning. To accept it is the next step. But the final step, the hardest and most transformative, is to love it. For when you can love even misfortune, you are untouchable. No exile can banish you. No poverty can degrade you. No death can frighten you. You have become aligned with the order of all things. This is amor fati. To meet each day not as a threat, but as a gift, even when wrapped in pain. To see fate not as enemy, but as companion. To say to whatever comes, yes, this too I will love. Why does this ancient thought experiment still matter? Why should the words of men long buried beneath marble ruins concern us in a world of satellites, skyscrapers, and digital noise? It matters because the human condition has not changed. We still fear loss. We still recoil from death. We still tremble when the future is uncertain. The Stoics remind us that these fears, left unchecked, shape the course of our lives more than any external chain. Fear makes us cautious when boldness is needed. It silences us when truth must be spoken. It binds us to comforts that rot us slowly, because we cannot imagine life without them. To live in fear is to live half a life. And so the Stoics taught that to free oneself from fear is to recover one's humanity. Imagine what it means to walk into each day knowing that nothing can truly take away the essence of who you are. Jobs may vanish, reputations crumble, fortunes evaporate, but your mind, your choices, your capacity to meet events with dignity, these remain untouched. That knowledge is not abstract. It changes how one breathes, how one speaks, how one acts. It replaces panic with clarity and hesitation with calm resolve. This is why Marcus Aurelius, even as emperor, did not surround himself only with soldiers and senators. He surrounded himself with reminders. He whispered to himself each morning, "You will meet with arrogance, deceit, ingratitude, treachery." He rehearsed these encounters not to grow bitter, but to remain steady. He knew that expecting betrayal made him less vulnerable to its sting, and that remembering mortality gave urgency to his duties. In a life of unimaginable pressure, it was this practice that kept him human. It matters because in our own age, we too are emperors of small realms. We govern households, careers, friendships, the fragile empire of our own days. And like Rome itself, our empires are temporary. The Stoics teach us not to cling to their permanence, but to govern them with justice while we can, and to release them when they pass. It also matters because premeditatio malorum sharpens gratitude in a world drowning in abundance. We have more possessions, more food, more comfort than the ancients could dream of, yet we often feel restless and unsatisfied. Why? Because we mistake more for enough. By imagining loss, the Stoic experiment corrects the eye. Suddenly, the meal before us is precious. The roof above us is wealth. The laugh of a friend is treasure. Gratitude, born of imagined absence, turns the ordinary into the extraordinary. But perhaps most of all, it matters because this experiment teaches us how to face the one certainty that shadows every life: death. We do not speak of it. We push it to the margins, bury it beneath entertainment and distraction. Yet it waits, patient, inevitable. The Stoics refused to avert their eyes. They taught that the man who rehearses death lives differently. He wastes less time. He forgives more quickly. He chooses his words carefully because he knows they may be his last. This is not about morbidity. It is about intensity. When you accept death, life becomes urgent. Each sunrise is no longer routine, but a miracle. Each breath is no longer unnoticed, but a gift. By facing the end, the Stoic finds the beginning of true living. The experiment also matters for how it reshapes our relationships. To remember that everyone we love is mortal is to see them more clearly. The anger that felt urgent softens. The grievance we clung to dissolves. What remains is tenderness, because we know the hour is brief. Epictetus urged parents not to avoid this truth, but to embrace it, so that their love would be fiercer, not weaker. We too can let this practice remind us that the people in our lives are temporary companions, and that each moment with them is sacred. And finally, it matters because it returns us to ourselves. In rehearsing the loss of all externals, we discover what cannot be lost. Wealth, health, reputation, family, even life itself, all may fall away. But the ability to judge wisely, to choose with integrity, to act with courage, remains until the final breath. This is the core of the Stoic creed, that no one can steal your soul's freedom unless you surrender it. So why does it matter? Because the world will continue to change, but our hearts will continue to wrestle with fear, attachment, and the fragility of time. The Stoic experiment is not an artifact. It is a compass. It points us back to what is essential: courage in the face of loss, gratitude in the presence of life, clarity in the shadow of death. And once you have walked through that experiment, once you have looked into the darkness and discovered that it does not own you, something fundamental shifts. You no longer cling so tightly. You no longer panic so quickly. You no longer waste so much time. You begin, perhaps for the first time, to live.